Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I assume it's afternoon for everybody. So today we are going to give a brief summary of the 4 workshops we held during this year. We call it ASCE-NIST Forward-Looking Codes and Standards. Next slide, please. Standard disclaimer for all ASCE presentations. So the background is basically, we're already seeing some increasing, magnitude and frequency of drivers that lead to hazards, and they include heat waves, intense precipitation, and severe storms and cyclones and droughts. And you only have to look at what happened in Hurricane Melissa. The rapid intensification is it's becoming a common event, and heavy precipitation events around the globe. So we feel that there is an urgent need to advance the design practices to incorporate these future hazards condition or future conditions into the codes and standards. And then SCI and American of the American Society of Civil Engineers contracted with NIST to develop and execute a series of 4 workshops on this objective of developing forward-looking codes and standards. Next slide, please. So why are we doing this? The overarching goal or the research roadmap for this is basically, as I mentioned, look at future hazards and the drivers that lead to those hazards and a warming temperature, both atmosphere and sea surface, humidity changes and droughts. And in terms of other drivers, hazards, future precipitation, both rain, snow, and ice, floods, wind, and earthquakes and wildfires. So we want to look at all these hazards and how they could be used, their future conditions, how could they be incorporated into the codes and standards. Uh, the, Another aspect that we focused in this workshop was something unique, in my opinion, is material and structural degradation. And I think, combined with non-stationary hazards, I consider a second level of non-stationarity or structural degradation. And in tandem, they might make things worse in terms of future conditions. And then finally, look at adaptation and resilience. So the goal is to identify and prioritize next generation gaps in research and for implementing future hazards and associated with design criteria for codes and standards, and inform strategic planning, hopefully by NIST, for future requirements in the built environment. Next slide, please. So we had a wonderful workshop steering committee. We met almost every Friday over the year. Organizing 4 workshops was a very challenging task. You see all the names in here, and some of you are in here in the meeting were part of that steering committee, and they were essential. Or they provided crucial input to organize the workshop. Next slide, please. We also had 5 people from NIST. Terry was our primary leader in that team, and she's the motivator for this workshop, and 4 others, as you could see, and SCI staff, Jennifer, Katie, Addie, and Jessica. So together, steering committee basically organized the workshop. So we had 4 workshops, and I will go through real quickly. And these are built so that information from one feeds into the other. And so they were very logical choices in that sense. We first, in June, looked at future hazards for design, particularly uncertainty aspects of hazards, downscaling, and so forth. And in July, we looked at those hazards and assess what are the future load effects on the built environment, because of these changing hazards. In September, we had looked at engineering design guidance, particularly focusing on non-stationarity, service life, design loads, and so forth. And in October, we wrapped up the series with the fourth workshop on adaptation and resilience. And Jennifer will go over some of the findings from each of these. So ordinarily, Terry would give this part of the presentation, but obviously she could be here. Next slide, please. So this is an important slide. The purpose was to provide what we call a science-based assessment of data and development needs to advance the design practices for buildings and infrastructure. So that is the primary purpose. And the scope included three items in here. One is prioritize what is needed to achieve the next generation future hazard condition for design. And this is going beyond ASCE 728. Think of 10 years from now, what would we be needing to update the codes and standards? Then identify a path forward to improve building standards and design practices. And finally, consider resilient adaptation and socioeconomic impacts on businesses and communities. There have been several organizations developing standards, and we have listed some of them here. National Building Code of Canada, we have Canadian colleagues who participated, and obviously the ASCE 728, and then other standards development organizations like AST, American Concrete Institute, and so forth. And finally, NIST and NOVA grants to support the ASCE 728, covering various hazards and also importantly, structural capacity and performance. Next slide, please. So we also talked about community business and business resilience. I won't spend too much time on that. And you see some of the pictures of what happened after major events. What is the recovery capacity of these systems after major events like this? Next slide, please. So there have been several synergistic efforts underway that we realize we are not going to duplicate these efforts, and we want to build on top of these ongoing efforts. NIST Climate Science Building Codes Workshop, SCI Climate Impact Workshops, and obviously NIST AC NOAA Community Resilience Workshops, AC 728, and something of interest to this group, obviously, is the AC NOAA Task Force efforts and summits, summer workshops, and AC committee, AC CAC committee that I think Craig will talk about a little later on. So we have several synergistic efforts ongoing. We've made an effort not to duplicate these, but build on top of these outcomes of these efforts. Next slide, please. I hand over to Jennifer to talk about the 4 workshops and some key findings. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Very good. Thank you, Obey. I am going to keep my camera off because it is I'm getting some feed like hiccups with the feed a little bit. I'm not sure what's going on. But I'm going to walk us through kind of how we set these things up, but also some of our key findings or preliminary findings from each of the 4, and let you know what will come next. So I'm going to watch the time here. We're a little bit nervous about getting through all this, but I'm going to go as quickly as I can, but slow down where I need to. So as Obey mentioned, SEI had the contract with NIST to execute these 4 workshops and collect the information from the subject matter experts that will be documented in reports and provided to NIST so they can build their research roadmap for the next generation of codes and standards. So each workshop had basically a template, I will mention that we put on the hardest workshops possible. They were fully hybrid, so we had people in the room, we had people online that were participating fully, and because it was a federal contract, we also had it available to the public, so we had a public option where they could view the presentations that happened in the morning. So each workshop consisted of these five same components where we had sessions in the morning that were open to the public. We had and then we closed that public session. Then after lunch, we had a plenary that would set the stage for our participants. And really, I like to describe our methodology for workshops, really to get these critical information out of these subject matter experts. We defined the state of the art. So what are we doing right now with each of the four workshop topics? And then we had the group walk through an exercise where we imagined the future scenario, like our ideal state in 10 years. What do you wish you had? You'll see that pop up in the remainder of the slides. Almost every single one we asked them, what do you wish you had? Um, so we defined state of the art and our ideal state, and then we sent them off into the breakout rooms. And so we did the breakouts a variety of different ways depending on the topic. So I'll get into a little bit of more of that later. And then we had a report out the next day with their top research needs, and then we did a prioritization exercise with the full group based on all of the needs that came out from the breakouts. So there on the right-hand side is just the one of the agendas. It looked very similar to that each time. We had a digital packet that included the agenda, participant list, and all the slide decks for the participants. So I'll start with the first one, as Obey mentioned, future hazards in design. If you recall back to that slide, we had each of these workshops built on each other, and we started with what I think is the one that we have thought about the most. I believe that we've spent quite a little bit of time, both as an engineering community and as a climate science community, thinking about future hazards. What are the future hazards? How are we going to assess them? How are we going to evaluate those hazards for design? We spent a lot of time thinking about this. So our purpose and our scope felt very familiar to us, I will say. And so we wanted to think about what this meant, but in terms of future codes, what are we going to need to do? And we wanted to move beyond just ASCE-7, as Obey mentioned. So here's a picture of the team. We had the folks in person and the folks online join us. And those presentations that we used to tee up kind of the state of the art, we broke into often. We had synergistic efforts, which was ongoing work that we wanted the groups to be aware of, that we were going to build on. And you can see some of the titles there from our participants. Um, that are many of you are on this call, but would inform our participants about the ongoing work that we're doing. Again, we wanted to be very careful not to be duplicative, but to be additive to the collective learning. So we had these synergistic presentations, and then we had some case studies, and we did this periodically throughout the four workshops to bring it right back to an example of what engineers and design professionals are really struggling with in this particular topic area. So our practice perspectives right there touched on a variety of different projects. And again, relative to trying to figure out the hazard. So we didn't ask them, what was your answer? We asked them, what was the methodology you used to try to understand that hazard? So after we had those morning presentations, we broke up into a plenary, and here we did a little bit of a deeper dive, and Joe Barsugli gave us a nice presentation from the findings from the NOAA summer workshop, because that summer workshop did a really nice job of documenting, collecting, and kind of giving us a state of the art of where we are in our understanding of the hazards, and we didn't want to duplicate that. So we used that as our basis for understanding. And then we asked the participants, really, you see that yellow arrow there. The goal of their exercise was to identify and prioritize the top 3 to 5 needs to address the gaps in the hazard data. What is it that we still think we need? So we sent them off to do their work. They came back, and we bucketed their topics into these 5 buckets: uncertainty and non-stationarity, hazard data, methods and models, design, and communication and knowledge. So this one really focused, the results were surprising to us, and then it really focused on communication and knowledge, among other things. But again, I believe that's because this one was the most thought out of all of the all of the topic areas, and we did not want to be duplicative. There's that draft report that we're working on to deliver. And then these two slides, they'll just show you some of the research needs, and these are all included in the report. So the research needs that were brought forward by the breakout groups and then prioritized by the full group. But I'm just going to spotlight two that I think are important, for this conversation. But the number 10 there that I highlighted on the bottom, make good or better use of the data sources and methodologies we're currently using with an actionable timescale. So there was a lot of discussion about we're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're not going to be able to reinvent how we do this, but let's use them better, use those sources better. And then on the right-hand side, you can see of those 5 buckets, we did check marks where we think this particular research need will address directly. And then those dots are where we think that would be a secondary effect. And then another one I want to cherry pick from this list, as we've been talking about for some time, is determine the service life window of future hazard data to extend the service life of design really beyond the 50 years. And so that really touched on all the buckets. But again, that is kind of a perennial discussion that we have with this and not anything new. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit here. So future load effects is the second one. And the purpose here was really these two needs for prioritized needs for estimating the load effects and then characterize how structural capacities might change under future conditions. So now we're moving beyond the hazard into really what do we need for design? And we need both sides of the equation, right? We need to understand the loads and we need to understand the capacity. So we started moving into that direction. Here's the team in person and online. And we had some folks that came into the workshops and stayed the whole time. We had some folks that came in and out of the workshops based on their expertise. So again, here's our synergistic efforts. We talked a lot to our colleagues in Canada, what they were working on, what they were learning, and the limitations of some of their work. We had a little deeper dive into what ASCE 728 is working on and their methodologies, assumptions, and decisions. Again, not the answer, but how are they thinking about this problem? And then we had some more, second part of this was on structural capacity. And so we looked to some colleagues out who have been working with structural capacity, effects on structural capacity from the changing hazard and what that looks like. And so we had some nice presentations from these folks here. Then we broke it into two because we had two distinct, I would say, topic areas. We really broke it into two sections for the breakout groups. One was really to characterize future load and load effects, and the second one was really to think about future effects on structural capacity. So we kind of broke that up. And we did this by hazard. It was the only one we actually did by hazard because we thought that this topic in particular was very unique. What you would need for flood would be very different than what you would need for, say, snow and ice. And that is very different from what you would need for structural capacity. So you can see there on the left-hand side, the breakout groups were truly done by hazard, and we had our participants self-select into which ones they felt most interested in. These are some of the highlights from the results. Again, I'm not going to read all of them. You can see we have the results organized by topic area. So this first one was on wind at the top left-hand. Table 4.1 was wind. Table 4.2 was inland flood and rain. Some of these things are familiar to us, but some of them surprised us, I would say. So the total ranking that you see here on the right-hand side represents what the full group decided that was the priority of these topic areas. So I'm sorry, there's a lot of information there. I'm not going to read all of them, but we had a breakout from each one: coastal flood, again, snow and permafrost. And we started to tease out this one that's on the bottom right-hand side, 4.5. That was our structural capacity group. So that group really started thinking again on the right-hand side of the equation where the capacity is, like, what are our assumptions in our current design methodologies, and how might those change? How might those be non-stationary in our future codes and standards? And are we going to have to think about it a little bit more, maybe inclusive of or beyond, say, routine maintenance? going into future engineering design guidance. That was our fourth workshop. And again, this was, I think, one of our harder topics to get our heads around because it's easy as design professionals and engineers to understand like how we calculate the loads. But then really to think about what are we going to need for design guidance, you have to remember we are dealing with a room that consisted of many engineers, and to get them to think we are asking you for what you need beyond give me the right code, give me the right standard. How are we going to develop those right codes? How are we going to develop those right standards? So that the purpose there, and you can see it on the slide, was really to assess our current practice and our development methodology. So again, you all have heard me many times present on slash complain about the fact that it takes 10 years from research into be fully adopted by the practice. We need to shorten that timeline. What does that look like? How can we ensure that we have practices that are still credible, fully vetted, that address all of these needs for design, but we have to be able to move a little bit faster, incorporate these things a little bit easier. Also, given I would say, the very prescient challenge we're having right now with federally funded research and federally funded activities, what else might this mean for us? So that was a really good discussion for them to start thinking about. Here's our team in person and online. And here we had our morning presentations. We broke them up again into structural capacity and degradation. So our first chunk really focused in on a mix of research and case studies, really looking at structural degradation and what we can learn about it to inform our design processes and what we might need to consider modifying in the future. And then we had a series of presentations also on future guidance beyond codes and standards. So really thinking about design scenarios, considering uncertainty. How can we up until this point, as you all might agree, we as design professionals decide we need this kind of answer, and then we go out and build the document to give us that process. Well, we're in a situation, obviously, with the uncertainty of the hazard, we're not going to know the answer. We have to be comfortable with uncertainty. We have to be comfortable with not knowing necessarily where we're going, but how are we going to keep going based on what we do know, and what do we understand as thresholds or design decisions that can influence when we need to pivot. So this was a really wonderful discussion about design scenarios. I must say, I learned so much from Dr. Limpert in his discussion on deep uncertainty. It felt like a light bulb moment for me personally. And then we had some case studies from some really well-known projects about how they actually considered this uncertainty in their design decision making. Really good. So again, we broke out into our breakouts, and again, the prompts, what do you wish you had? What are the next generation needs? And again, we broke those into the participants self-selected into a structural capacity breakouts or the future guidance breakouts. And I forgot to mention, but we had those groups that were virtual and in person. So we had a virtual breakout group and an in-person breakout group for each of these two topics. And it actually went surprisingly well. I think we did a pretty good job thinking through the needs for that. But then we came up with our top lists for both capacity and design. And so you can see here the structural capacity. This one, if you look at it, and I kind of went real fast by the last one, but the structural capacity in workshop 3 really aligned with some of the needs that we started to tease out in workshop 2 based on structural capacity research needs. So taking these all together, really looking at ways to understand how our design standards can address this uncertainty, which we don't do right now. We set it and forget it, as you know. Um, so then we talked about future guidance and what kinds of documents we would need, what kinds of development ecosystems or something we would need. We talked a lot about performance-based design and understanding decision and deep uncertainty decision frameworks, which was also very interesting, flexible, the ability to be flexible in our design documents and giving the jurisdictions what they need to be able to enforce. So it was a nice, really good discussion on that. And then our last one that we just had last week, 2 weeks ago, was adaptation and resilience. So this felt like the crowning moment of everything else that we had worked on up until that point, to really get our groups to start our subject matter experts to start thinking of ways to identify engineering strategies for enhancing resilience. Um, because of our evolving hazards into our design documents. And that was kind of the key, like building on all these things that we don't know, the uncertainty, our design needs for loads and capacity, and then looking at our how we develop our documents. This one felt like the culmination of all of that good thinking for how we would provide NIST some ideas for their research roadmap. Here's the team in person and online. And again, we had really nice synergistic efforts from a lot of the, I would say, experts in the space of resilience who talked a lot about community resilience, codes and standards, robust decision making, design pathways, and adaptive pathways from their experience and from their research. And then we had a series of case studies for using those types of tools to actually move forward with some big projects. In some big jurisdictions that had the resources to do it, let's say, how design professionals are walking their clients and their jurisdictions through these decision making when they don't necessarily have the answer. So those were wonderful discussions. And then for this final one, our plenary discussion, really, we had a treat where we invited some jurisdictions to come in. So we had Jennifer Gerardo from Broward County and Rogelio Madan from Miami Beach. And they came in and talked about really what it's like um, to be on the ground. So we titled their plenary Reality on the Ground If I Had a Magic Wand, to really hear from these professionals, what are they up against? So they have, their jurisdictions have made certain decisions, they have certain design standards, and what is it that they need? I challenged this group, if your successor in 10 years is sitting at your desk, what do they need to do their job that is missing today? And so they provided our team with our their thoughts to kind of prime the pump, if you will, on their breakout. So this was the fourth and final workshop breakout. Everyone had the same questions. What do you wish you had to advance design practice and building standards? And they came back with um, some really, I think, good ideas. Nothing that we did, this is my thought on it, you guys. It wasn't like there was an aha moment, like, oh, we don't need this, or, this was amazingly surprising, but it was memorializing all of the understanding from these subject matter experts who have been either in the field or researching this from some time, and we documented it in here. So this little graph, table 4.2 in the draft report, really just chooses or kind of selected those top six from, I think we had 20 actually at the end of the day, but it really picked out the top six that received either highest priority or highest priority results or priority results across the line. And so you can see some of those that are in there. Again, I could read it, but really changing the paradigm for how we do design to really incorporate adaptation and resilience into all levels of how we do our work. It felt very much like motherhood and apple pie, but in the actual report, there's a lot of more granularity to this. And then again, going down the line, established geographically tested data sets, that really give design professionals what they need to kind of do this work. Okay, wrapping up. That's not all. We just went through all those four workshops and those reports that are drafted. The last thing that we're doing is we're taking all four of those and we're drafting a final report, which really is a final synthesis of everything that we learned across each four workshops. So if you want to think about each individual workshop report as kind of being the record, this is who was there, this is what we talked about, this is what we decided was our priority. This fifth and final report will really be the synthesis of all those things, kind of tying together the research needs that were identified from the hazard, load effects, design guidance, and then into adaptation resilience. So our team really literally just started working on this. We just finished our fourth report. So TBD on this one, but it's per our contract, it's due out in Q1 of 2026. So we'll be working hard on that in the next several months to get that to the public. But that's pretty much it. Megan and Dan, that was a real whirlwind tour of what we did, why we did it, like preliminary, very preliminary results. Um, and we're happy to talk about it now. If anybody has any comments or questions, but thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. I appreciate the time both you and Obey put into this. So that's great. Let's open it up for questions or reactions. Anybody want to start? You can use your hand feature or you can just wave at me. All right, well, then I'll see if I can get the ball rolling here a little bit. Um,
Sure.
Obviously, you covered a great deal of ground. Um, I've got like three questions. I'll just do them one at a time. The first one
Okay.
is, um, did you get a sense in these discussions? Are there some things that I see the function of the task force as trying to work with the federal agencies primarily to identify and provide the data that will be used when these different approaches are implemented. Um, did
Okay.
did we do a pretty good job in the previous workshops identifying those data sets? Is there any, did you get any sense across all this discussion that the task force should maybe change its approach to finding that data? Was there any aha moment in that regard?
For me personally, I don't think so, Dan. I think we did a lot of building upon the work that has been done by the task force on purpose. We didn't want to re-examine the work that was done here because it was good work. I think what we did was take that and try to refine it a little bit to say, okay, not the question of if you had the magic wand, but how do we, what is it that we think we need in a not technically, not like we need XYZ for flood, but how do we change our processing? How do we change our thinking around our traditional way of, as I mentioned earlier, coming up with making the design assumption and then creating that path forward to achieving the results? Like we don't know what that is at the end of the game. We have to start getting ourselves comfortable with not knowing and how are our design standards and codes going to be able to reflect that? How are they going to be flexible in their approach? So Dan, we didn't do, and Obey, please chime in on here, but I think we were purposeful not to dig into that same question, but really build on that. And Joe did a nice job of presenting that to our team to say, this is the state of the art right now, and this is what we know we need based on that NOAA Summer Summit. And then the subject matter experts that were in the room said yes, and what we really need to do is start communicating. We need to change our education. We need to, educate our clients. And so that actually, to be honest, and I don't think this is a surprise, or I don't think this is a secret, wasn't necessarily something NIST was looking for. Like communication is not their lane. They really wanted to understand the more technical pieces of it that they could put into like a research roadmap. But I think building on what we understood from topic number one, which was the hazard, then we could start thinking about load effects from those hazards and those hazard unknowns, and then the design approach, and then resilience. So I think it was a wonderful like first stop for this group that kind of continued over the year, over the summer, really from July until October, thinking about these things collectively to say, others have done the good work of understanding what the hazard needs are. How do we move this on to taking that uncertainty and moving it into our process? So I think, and I'm sure you'll love to dig into the results from workshop one day, but I can tell you that the surprise was education, awareness, change our purview, right? This is our purview as design professionals, and we need to lean in. Those were the kinds of things. And Obey, I would invite you to comment on that too for Dan, but that was my impression.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. A couple of things. One is, I don't know if this is relevant to the task force topics, but this whole focus on structural degradation, I think is an important, along with the hazard non-stationarity. That's number one. And the
Yes.
other aspect is the how do you deal with this uncertainty, which sometimes could be deep. This whole adaptive pathway, I think, was something that we emphasized, particularly in workshop number 4. In terms of the other data that I think are very similar to what you have perhaps in the task force.
Right, right. No, that's great, and that's I mean, since there's so much overlap here, that's kind of what I assumed. I guess the question that I have, and maybe as as the reports come out, we can revisit this, but I think we've done a pretty good job of identifying the different types of hazard data, the types of hazard data that we would ideally like the federal government or someone to provide.
Right.
Yeah.
The specifications on what that data should look like in terms of whether you know uh, how sensitive the design decision is going to be to that data, and therefore what is the kind of the specifications that we would want to convey to the agencies. Maybe that will change a little bit. But that's kind of my reaction, and I'm looking forward to seeing the reports and discussing this more, because I
Yeah.
I think I'm coming around to the bigger question, really. But I think the more refined we can be in our basically our needs, or our specifications, I think we're more likely to get the data that we need in a form we want it from, the data collectors and the data providers. That's my
Yeah.
long shot.
Yeah, it came out a little bit, Dan, in this last one, and you can see here number 2, establish standardized geographically targeted data sets that are consistent with standard design and codes used for use and resilience. So we spent a little bit of time talking about the needs for, and we've done it in a lot of places, like data that's fit for purpose. What is it that they actually need, and when do they actually need it? So we talked a little bit about it, and then you see it down here too. Leverage existing hazard and building performance data to inform the performance-based design. And so they got into a little bit at the end, but without touching into the granularity of specificity of what was already established in workshop 1, but just to really drive home and connect those dots, I would say, between the hazard need and the ability to do like a performance-based design or something. So that again, I think it was there, but we did not necessarily go into the type granularity beyond that first one. And I could probably go back and hang on, I can look a little closer at some of these results, but these are, kind of the hazard load effects portion of this. It was how do we take that hazard and put that into loads was what we were asking the team. So it was less about understanding the uncertainty of the data, but understanding the uncertainty of getting a load from a specific hazard. That's where we were trying to get them to think about.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's great. I guess suffice to say, we're going to have to start giving some thought to what the ASCE NOAA Task Force summer meeting in
Yeah.
2026 is going to
Yeah.
cover. And I
Okay.
think, really kind of trying to scrub these workshop reports, and like, is there something where we can advance progress toward, what we've identified, either through the task force meetings or this ASCE NIST NOAA conversation. So I'll just throw that out there as something that we probably
Okay.
think about going forward.
I see. Okay.
All right. Joe, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to comment on that the business case workshop that we had, um, that came up a lot.
Yes.
And I just think that the resources we have from that workshop really need to be disseminated more widely if possible, because a lot of the topics that were touched on, it was kind of like, well, that's really interesting and we talked about it, but that really wasn't the focus also of, well, part of it was the focus of this because they do economic analysis,
Yeah. Mm.
right? But part of it, wasn't. And I just think that resource, I just think bringing that into the discussion, leveraging that as well as just the data sources, um, might be useful.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Joe, because that was actually going to be my next question is, how much does the business case part of all of this came up? And just real quickly, just so you know, we're kind of in a bit of a between a rock and a hard place right here. The summary report was finalized, it was approved, it was signed off. It was literally at the NOAA library for posting when the shutdown occurred. And
Oh, wow.
I
Okay.
can't even get a hold of anybody at NOAA to say, can I go ahead and distribute this? Okay. So
Okay.
what we might do if this continues and is I might think about distributing a close hold version, like an embargoed copy to the task
Okay.
force members. And
Yeah.
and by that virtue, then that would allow you, Jennifer, and Obey and others to say, okay, well, are there some, you know, is there something here that we should be doing more with, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But that is literally where we are. I mean, the last step in the posting process was to, make sure that it was compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And that was literally where it was when the shutdown occurred. Uh,
Okay.
so I don't think I mean, the sensitivity here is, um, I don't want to get anybody at NOAA in hot water, right? So I
Sure.
if we maybe circulated it to the task force members and said, do you feel like is there really a compelling argument to get this out? I'd be interested in hearing it.
Okay.
You should see the document if you haven't already. It's in some form, because it's just a lot of summaries and pointing to the actual recordings, which are publicly available, right?
Okay.
So that might be the approach we take because we can certainly distribute, the recordings and I think we would be on fairly firm ground. Maybe instead of like actually distributing the report itself as a publicly available document before NOAA posts it, maybe
Okay.
find some combination of the recordings and summary slides and get that out. And then, so that might be another approach too.
Okay.
Um, anyway, that's all super good. But yeah, we do need to, I guess this is going to be, I'm going to just reiterate, I think when Amanda and Noah and then our federal partners come back online, I think if we just start planning the summer workshop when they get back,
Okay.
it's going to be painful. So I think we kind of from an ASCE perspective probably ought to
Okay.
come to the January meeting with some suggestions of what we think would be useful to the ASCE community for that workshop. Otherwise, it's going to be even more of a crush than it normally is. So I'll just throw that out there. So is there anything that you're coming out of these workshops that you think, would be something that we should certainly consider or pitch to our federal partners for that summer workshop meeting? Want to drill down into more?
I hadn't been thinking about that in
I'm sure you haven't.
I will think I hadn't thought about that, Dan.
Yeah,
Um,
you got enough going on. So I'm just fair warning. How about that?
okay, fair warning taken. All right, we will. I can. Our team is pivoting now into this, like I said, final synthesis type report. Up until now, it really was just a sprint to the finish of get the workshop organized, execute it. Get the workshop organized and execute. And then we have have written these draft reports. So I feel like the team has just been going like gangbusters on just executing, and hasn't really had enough time to come up for air really on a synthesis. I mean, I'm sure Joe and Obey would agree with that statement.
Oh yeah,
So
obviously.
we, as we
And
start to pivot kind of into that place of synthesizing our
right,
findings from our reports, surely we can consider. I mean, there's enough of us on our workshop steering committee. You saw the names that overlap with this task force that we can start thinking about, if there's
mm,
anything in particular that the community would really benefit from
yeah.
as part of the workshop or something, the summer
Well,
meeting.
yeah, I mean, I think I would be fairly confident saying I would expect us to talk about the results of these workshops at the summer workshop in the context of how does moving to performance-based, what's the implication of moving to performance-based standards for
Yeah.
data needs?
Okay.
I
Okay.
think that would be a very obvious example.
Right, right. Yeah. That was big part of the workshop number 4 actually. Um, but
So,
we also didn't have Terry for a whole month, so we didn't have chance to
right,
talk
yeah,
with
it's
her.
hard. I know it's hard.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Anybody else have any other questions? Um, I guess the other thing too that we need to give as a task force, we need to give a little bit of thought to is obviously this is, ASCE 7 and the SEI standards are very prominent, very widely used, but they don't cover, I would say, even many of I don't even know if I would say they cover the majority of the use cases, for engineering design, for other applications, for the horizontal infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Mhm.
how to get those other communities up to a point where they can, kind of discuss, like in my mind, take away from the discussion that you all have had, and then what's the implications of this for like the horizontal infrastructure? Is it applicable at all? Is it irrelevant?
Yeah.
I feel like that's the other aspect because, we want to bring the broader community along, and
Yeah.
leveraging work that SEI does is certainly a strategy for doing that. Uh,
Yeah. You know what, Dan? I'll have my last comment here, sorry, and then I'll let you move on. But it's interesting to think about that, to be honest. It's really interesting. So this was not limited to buildings. It was, we focused on codes and standards as a regulatory framework because it's very strong for buildings. In fact, we hear from, the design professionals who are being asked by their clients or jurisdiction, you need to incorporate this, and there's no design standards. And so I feel like for the vertical infrastructure, it's so regulated that they're really painted into a corner about what they could do or how that would be acceptable, that's where it's bubbling to the surface. I would argue that the horizontal infrastructure has a lot more flexibility in their approach, and they can consider a multitude of resources to be able to recommend or suggest to the client or the jurisdiction, this is how we could do it because it's not such a tight framework of regulation. So it feels like even though we're driving it from the SEI point of view because we are all about standards and codes and that's kind of the space we live in, I feel like the horizontal, you saw many, if you could read the slides when I flashed through them, many of the case studies were water. They were water infrastructure on coastlines, or they were bridges relative to water. That is where the thinking is happening in the design space right now. That's where those designers, based on their jurisdictional needs or their client needs, are really able, I would say, to think outside the box for some of these solutions, where the buildings folks are really painted into a corner about what they can use, which is why we want to get stuff into ASCE 7, we want to get stuff into the code, so the designers and the jurisdictions have some like escape hatch, like they have a way to do this work. So the two environments of regulation and design are just different. And so I wouldn't say that because SEI is leading this work with a contract like this, that this the vertical design professionals are ahead at all. I would say the other, honestly. And it could be that the community isn't aware of some of these resources, but I think the folks who have presented to us in all of these 4 workshops have done really deep thinking around this for their clients. And they kind of drag along, I would say, the buildings and those kinds of things, but they've thought about it from the perspective of water. I would say 75% of the case studies were those kinds of situations. So I'm learning a lot where I sit based on the needs, and also the ability for design professionals in the horizontal space. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, my observation is that water related hazards are driving a lot of, so that makes
Yes.
it's not surprising. But on the flip side, I was in Seattle, and a lot of the discussion there is the impact of the disconnect sometimes between, the vertical and the horizontal infrastructure.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, we've got a nice, safe building, but nobody can get there because the roads are all underwater.
Yeah.
Those kinds of issues.
Yeah.